On January 6, 1767, in the Danish colony of St. Thomas, a child was born who would one day terrify the very heart of America's slave-holding South. His name was Denmark Vesey. For decades, he lived as just another name on an auction ledger, another body in the brutal machinery of human bondage. But hidden beneath the silence of his chains burned a vision so vast, so audacious, that even whispers of it would plunge Charleston, South Carolina, into hysteria. Unlike most enslaved men, Vesey would one day win his freedom. But freedom, he discovered, was a cruel illusion when his wife and children remained in bondage. And so he began to dream, not of escape, not of hiding in swamps or fleeing north. His dream was darker, bloodier. Denmark Vesey envisioned an army of thousands, rising in the dead of night, torching Charleston to ash, slaughtering every slaveholder in their beds, and seizing ships in the harbor to sail toward Haiti, the Black Republic that had humiliated Europe. In 1822, Charleston would discover that the most dangerous rebel was not the man with chains on his wrists, but the man with freedom in his pocket and fire in his heart. This is the story of the free black prophet who nearly unleashed America's bloodiest slave rebellion. A man whose name was erased from Charleston's streets, but whose ghost still lingers in every shadow of the South. Denmark Vesey's earliest memories were not of freedom, but of the sea. The suffocating stench of bodies crammed below deck, the cries of children who would never again see their homeland. He was sold as cargo, a boy with no name, no future, just another profit to be made in the Atlantic trade. The man who purchased him was a slaver named Captain Joseph Vesey. Denmark would carry his master's name for the rest of his life, a constant reminder that even his identity had been stripped away. The boy was taken from St. Thomas to Charleston, South Carolina, a city where the slave market thrived like a grotesque heartbeat. Here, men, women, and children were bought, sold, and branded under the gaze of traders who saw nothing but numbers on a ledger. But even as a child, Vesey stood out. He was sharp, quick-tongued, defiant in ways that unnerved those who tried to break him. Captain Vesey noticed the boy's intelligence and placed him in service not in the fields, but at his side. A cabin boy on voyages between Africa, the Caribbean, and America. The ocean became his classroom. He learned languages, navigated ports, overheard the whispers of sailors, and absorbed the dangerous idea that somewhere, across the sea, there were lands where black men were not property. Still, he remained enslaved. Every kindness from his master came with a chain attached. Every glimpse of the wider world was followed by the crack of a whip, reminding him where he belonged. By the time he reached his teens, Vesey had seen enough of human misery to understand one truth that would haunt him forever. Slavery was not just a system. It was a disease that devoured the soul of everyone it touched, master and slave alike. And quietly, deep inside, he began to imagine a cure. In 1799, fate handed Denmark Vesey what every enslaved man dreamed of, but almost none achieved: a chance at freedom. It came not through mercy, nor through rebellion, but through a lottery ticket. With winnings worth $1,500, Vesey purchased the unthinkable, his own freedom. At 32 years old, He walked out of bondage and into the streets of Charleston as a free man. But freedom in Charleston was a cruel paradox. Yes, he could move through the city without chains. He could open a business as a carpenter, speak without a master's permission, even earn money of his own. Yet every coin he touched reminded him of those still shackled, especially the family he could not save. His wife and children remained enslaved, property of another man. And in the twisted logic of Charleston's slave code, Vesey had no legal right even to purchase them back. He was free in name, but his bloodline remained in bondage. Imagine the torment, to taste liberty with one hand while the other was chained by laws designed to keep freedom just out of reach. Each time Vesey visited his family, he was forced to leave them behind, returning to his modest home while they returned to the quarters of slaves. He began to see freedom itself as a lie. What kind of liberty was this, when one's children could be sold away at a master's whim? This bitterness festered, turning into a vision not of individual escape, but of collective liberation. A vision where no man, woman, or child in Charleston would ever again be sold like cattle. By winning his own freedom, Denmark Vesey had unlocked not just his body, but his imagination, and what he imagined would one day terrify America. Charleston, South Carolina, the jewel of the South. Cobblestone streets, grand houses with iron balconies, and markets overflowing with rice, indigo, and cotton. But beneath the charm, the city pull said with something darker. Charleston was built on slavery, not just economically, but spiritually. By 1820, the black population outnumbered the white. On paper, Charleston was a city of merchants and planters. In truth, it was a garrison town, always bracing for war against the very people who sustained it. Everywhere, the system of surveillance screamed paranoia. Slave patrols stalked the streets after sundown, muskets in hand, ready to whip or shoot any black man who dared step outside without a pass. Bells tolled to mark curfew for the enslaved, their echoes like iron bars closing around the city each night. Plantation owners whispered about Haiti, the Black Republic that had risen from fire and blood, where enslaved men and women had annihilated their masters. To Charleston's white elite, Haiti was not just a nightmare, it was a prophecy. And yet, Charleston depended on the very population it feared most. Enslaved dock workers unloaded ships in the harbor. Black artisans built the mansions they would never live in. Black women nursed white children while their own went hungry. The city's wealth gleamed like polished silver, but it was all stained in blood. For the enslaved, Charleston was a prison without walls. For the free blacks, like Vesey, it was a mockery. A place where freedom was tolerated but never trusted, where any step out of line could end in a whipping post or a lynching tree. It was in this boiling cauldron of wealth and terror that Denmark Vesey began to whisper his dangerous vision. In Charleston, fear already lived in every white heart. Vesey's plan would turn that fear into fire. In Charleston, one place became the beating heart of black hope, the African Methodist Episcopal Church. To whites, it was simply a house of worship. To the enslaved, it was something far more dangerous, a gathering place, a school, a sanctuary where the Bible was read not as submission, but as prophecy. Denmark Vesey was one of its founders. From the pulpit, he preached Exodus with fire in his voice. "Let my people go." For enslaved men and women, these were not distant words. They were a command, spoken in the present tense. The church became a secret engine of resistance. Prayers were laced with coded language. Hymns doubled as instructions. And late at night, when candles burned low, Vesey's sermons turned into strategy sessions. Charleston's authorities watched with suspicion. They had seen what happened in Haiti, how sermons and scripture had sparked a revolution that drowned an island in blood. The city council began sending spies into the church, listening for sedition hidden between psalms. But the more they tried to suppress it, the more powerful the church became. Every whipping, every insult, every child torn from a mother's arms gave Vesey's words a sharper edge. He told his followers that slavery was not just cruel. It was a sin against God, a crime that demanded fire and retribution. Here, in the flickering light of Charleston's black church, Vesey's dream began to take form. Not escape, not survival, but holy war. And the men who listened to him would carry those whispers back into the slave quarters, spreading them like sparks through dry straw. By the 1820s, Denmark Vesey was no longer just a carpenter or a preacher. He had become a prophet. Night after night, he pored over the Old Testament, his fingers trembling as they traced the words of Exodus, Isaiah, and Joshua. These were not distant stories to him. They were blueprints. He read of Moses' defying Pharaoh, of Israel's deliverance through plagues and fire, and he whispered to his closest followers, "The same God who freed them will free us." But Vesey's interpretation was not meek or patient. He spoke of wrath. He pointed to scriptures where the Lord commanded his people to strike down their oppressors without mercy, to leave no trace of the wicked. Each verse became an instruction manual for rebellion. He told his listeners that slavery was a sin so great that only blood could wash it away. Freedom would not come with petitions or prayers. It would come with the sword. Slowly, quietly, he began to choose men he could trust. Strong dock workers who knew the harbor, artisans who could move through Charleston unnoticed, field hands who carried the bitterness of the lash on their backs. To them, he revealed his secret. God had given him a mission. The whispers spread like wildfire. Vesey was gathering an army, an invisible congregation of the desperate, the broken, and the faithful, bound together by one terrifying promise, that Charleston would burn. Every sermon grew sharper, every hymn heavier with meaning. For Vesey and his chosen few, worship had transformed into war council. The spark had been lit, and once fire takes root in dry wood, it can never be contained. By 1821, Denmark Vesey's whispers had become an underground current running through Charleston. What began with a handful of trusted men swelled into hundreds. Dock workers on the wharves, blacksmiths in their forges, field hands trudging back from the plantations, all carried the secret in their hearts. A storm was coming. Meetings were held in back rooms, stables, and the dim candlelight of the African church. Nothing was written down. Every detail was spoken, memorized, and carried forward like a sacred chant. Those invited were forced to swear oaths of secrecy on the Bible itself, hands trembling as they promised death before betrayal. Vesey's lieutenants spread across Charleston like shadows. Rollins the blacksmith, Monday Gell, and Gullah Jack, a mysterious conjurer said to command spirits. Each recruited their own circle of followers. The network grew, invisible yet everywhere. Plans were discussed in whispers over workbenches, coded into songs sung in the fields, and carried in the pauses between hammer strikes and saw blades. Every man knew his role. Every household, every street, every patrol route was studied and memorized. The conspiracy became a living organism. It breathed in silence and exhaled in rumor. And though Charleston's white citizens walked the same streets, they had no idea that beneath their feet, beneath the surface of their daily lives, a rebellion was coiling tighter and tighter, preparing to strike. By the summer of 1822, Vesey commanded not dozens, not hundreds, but possibly thousands, more than any slave rebellion America had ever seen. It was not just a conspiracy anymore. It was an army in waiting. The details of Denmark Vesey's plan were as terrifying as they were simple. On a chosen summer night, Charleston would be set ablaze. Armed bands of rebels would fan out through the streets, breaking into homes, slaughtering white families as they slept. No man, woman, or child would be spared. Mercy was forbidden. Vesey insisted that only terror equal to slavery itself could break its chains. While fire consumed the city, others would storm the arsenals, seizing muskets, pistols, and sabers. Slave patrols, caught off guard, would be overwhelmed before they could rally. Dock workers, already positioned at the harbor, would secure ships. And then, the final stage. Charleston would not be rebuilt. It would be abandoned. Vesey and his army of thousands would sail to Haiti, the only free black republic in the world. There, they would live not as fugitives, but as citizens, welcomed by a nation born in blood and defiance. The plan carried both brilliance and madness. Every detail had been considered. The timing of patrols, the location of guard posts, the weak points in Charleston's defenses. Yet it relied on absolute secrecy and absolute unity. If even one man broke, if even one whisper slipped, the entire dream would collapse in an instant. Still, Vesey's followers clung to it like scripture. For men and women who had lived entire lives in chains, the thought of Charleston burning was not horror. It was salvation. And Vesey, the prophet, promised them this: "If we are to die, we shall die as free men." By 1822, Vesey's sermons had transformed into something far more than religious comfort. They were weapons. From the pulpit of the African church, he thundered against Pharaoh, against Babylon, against every oppressor who had dared to chain God's children. But the men listening knew these were not distant villains from Scripture. Vesey was speaking of Charleston itself. His voice grew harder, sharper. He spoke of God's wrath, of holy fire and swords bathed in blood. He promised that on the appointed night, angels themselves would march with them, and that their enemies would fall as surely as the Canaanites before Joshua. For the enslaved, his words were a lifeline, proof that their suffering had meaning, that God had not abandoned them. For free blacks, his message carried an even darker weight. Freedom was nothing unless it was shared. But rumors began to leak beyond the church walls. White Charlestonians heard whispers of strange meetings, of a prophet promising deliverance through fire. Dockside taverns buzzed with talk that the slaves were planning something, that the city itself trembled with secrets. Fear crept into the nights of the masters. They oiled their muskets and kept them by their beds. They doubled patrols, sent spies into the quarters, watched their slaves with growing suspicion. And yet, they still underestimated Vesey. They saw him as a free black carpenter. Clever, perhaps dangerous, but not capable of orchestrating the death of an entire city. They did not understand the power of belief. Vesey had turned scripture into strategy, faith into fury. He had convinced men that to strike down their masters was not murder. It was obedience to God. And once men believe they are the instruments of heaven, there is no terror they will not unleash. For months, Vesey's conspiracy spread like roots beneath the soil of Charleston, unseen, unstoppable. But every root has weakness. And in 1822, fear became the blade that cut through his growing army. Not every enslaved man was willing to risk his life, his family, or the fragile security of his place on the plantation. Some believed Vesey's promises of freedom. Others only heard the echo of death. A rebellion meant slaughter, not just of masters but of the rebels themselves, hunted down with vengeance. One by one, doubts began to seep in. Whispers of the plan reached men who could not hold their nerve. Some went to their masters, trembling as they revealed fragments of the conspiracy. Others told fellow slaves, hoping to warn them away, never realizing that loose words spread faster than fire. Within days, Charleston's white authorities caught wind of something. Rumors of a Haitian-style massacre, of thousands ready to strike. The whispers were vague, uncertain, but they were enough. Enough to make a city already living in fear suddenly tremble on its foundations. Patrols were doubled, suspicion sharpened. Vesey did not yet know it, but betrayal was already coiling around his throat. The dream of fire and liberation was beginning to unravel, not from the outside, but from within. And in Charleston, the cost of a whisper was death. By 1822, Vesey's sermons had transformed into something far more than religious comfort. They were weapons. From the pulpit of the African church, he thundered against Pharaoh, against Babylon, against every oppressor who had dared to chain God's children. But the men listening knew these were not distant villains from Scripture. Vesey was speaking of Charleston itself. His voice grew harder, sharper. He spoke of God's wrath, of holy fire and swords bathed in blood. He promised that on the appointed night, angels themselves would march with them, and that their enemies would fall as surely as the Canaanites before Joshua. For the enslaved, his words were a lifeline, proof that their suffering had meaning, that God had not abandoned them. For free blacks, his message carried an even darker weight. Freedom was nothing unless it was shared. But rumors began to leak beyond the church walls. White Charlestonians heard whispers of strange meetings, of a prophet promising deliverance through fire. Dockside taverns buzzed with talk that the slaves were planning something, that the city itself trembled with secrets. Fear crept into the nights of the masters. They oiled their muskets and kept them by their beds. They doubled patrols, sent spies into the quarters, watched their slaves with growing suspicion. And yet, they still underestimated Vesey. They saw him as a free black carpenter. Clever, perhaps dangerous, but not capable of orchestrating the death of an entire city. They did not understand the power of belief. Vesey had turned Scripture into strategy, faith into fury. He had convinced men that to strike down their masters was not murder. It was obedience to God. And once men believe they are the instruments of heaven, there is no terror they will not unleash. For months, Vesey's conspiracy spread like roots beneath the soil of Charleston, unseen, unstoppable. But every root has weakness. And in 1822, fear became the blade that cut through his growing army. Not every enslaved man was willing to risk his life, his family, or the fragile security of his place on the plantation. Some believed Vesey's promises of freedom. Others only heard the echo of death. A rebellion meant slaughter, not just of masters but of the rebels themselves, hunted down with vengeance. One by one, doubts began to seep in. Whispers of the plan reached men who could not hold their nerve. Some went to their masters, trembling as they revealed fragments of the conspiracy. Others told fellow slaves, hoping to warn them away, never realizing that loose words spread faster than fire. Within days, Charleston's white authorities caught wind of something. Rumors of a Haitian-style massacre, of thousands ready to strike. The whispers were vague, uncertain, but they were enough. Enough to make a city already living in fear suddenly tremble on its foundations. Patrols were doubled. Suspicion sharpened. Vesey did not yet know it, but betrayal was already coiling around his throat. The dream of fire and liberation was beginning to unravel, not from the outside, but from within. And in Charleston, the cost of a whisper was death. Charleston awoke to the sound of chains. In late June 1822, the city erupted as authorities began seizing men in the night. Armed patrols stormed homes and dragged black men from their beds, some free, some enslaved, all accused of whispering Vesey's name. The city jail swelled with prisoners, iron shackles clanging against stone floors as interrogators demanded confessions. Rumor now raced faster than truth. White families locked their doors, clutching pistols, convinced that an army of thousands was about to descend upon them. Mothers hushed their children, terrified that a single spark could ignite Charleston into bloodshed. Every black face became a threat. Free men who had lived peaceably for years were suddenly hauled into custody. Dock workers were accused of plotting to seize ships. Carpenters, preachers, laborers, all branded conspirators, whether guilty or not. The patrols moved like hunters, muskets gleaming in the torchlight. On the streets, silence fell heavy. Even those who knew nothing of Vesey's plans felt the noose tighten. To be accused was to be doomed. The authorities had little proof, but proof was no longer the point. Charleston was panicking, and in panic suspicion becomes a weapon sharper than any blade. Denmark Vesey, once the prophet of liberation, had now become Charleston's nightmare, and the hunt for him, and for every whisper of his rebellion, had only just begun. Charleston's leaders understood one thing. If Vesey's conspiracy were laid bare in open court, it could ignite the very uprising they feared. And so, justice was hidden in the shadows. The accused were not given public hearings. Instead, they were dragged into closed chambers, locked behind the walls of the guardhouse, where a court of magistrates and freeholders convened in secrecy. No lawyers, no press, no appeals. Inside, the air was thick with sweat and fear. Men sat in chains before judges who had already decided their fate. Testimonies were coaxed, threatened, sometimes torn out by intimidation. One man's word, whether true or false, could doom another. Confessions stacked upon confessions, some whispered through trembling lips, others shouted in desperation. Were they real, or were they the inventions of terrified men who hoped vainly to save their own necks? Charleston would never know. The city's leaders did not want clarity. They wanted control. Every name given, every story told expanded the list of suspects. Dozens became hundreds, and each revelation only deepened the sense of conspiracy, as if an invisible army was hidden behind every door. Through it all, Vesey himself remained defiant, calm, silent, refusing to betray his followers. His composure unnerved the court. Here was a man who had plotted to drown Charleston in fire, and yet he sat like stone, as if already certain of his fate. The verdicts were inevitable. Guilt had been decided before the trials began. The secret court was not searching for truth. It was staging a ritual, one that would end on the gallows. July 1822. The trials were over, the verdicts inevitable. Now came the spectacle. In Charleston's public square, gallows rose against the summer sky. Crude wooden frames built not for justice but for terror. Crowds gathered, white citizens pressing forward to see the men who had nearly brought their city to ruin. Children perched on shoulders, wives clutched their husbands' arms, all waiting to witness death. One by one, Vesey's followers were led out in chains. Some prayed aloud, others cursed their masters to the end. The ropes tightened, the trapdoors dropped, and bodies swung in the heat, their shadows stretching long across the cobblestones. Then came Denmark Vesey himself, 65 years old, but his back straight, his eyes burning with the same fire that had once filled the African church. He said little, he did not plead, he did not beg. He only looked out over the crowd as if seeing something beyond Charleston, something greater than the scaffold before him. When the trap gave way, Vesey's body fell, and the crowd exhaled as though a nightmare had finally ended. But for Charleston's leaders, the nightmare was not finished. In all, 34 men were executed, hanged in waves across the city, their corpses left dangling long enough for the message to sink in. This is the price of rebellion. Their names were stripped from records, their families silenced, their memory buried under fear. But memory is not so easily erased. For every swing of the rope, for every body twisting in the hot Carolina air, whispers carried the story further, and those whispers would echo for generations. The gallows did not end Charleston's terror, they only deepened it. In the wake of Vesey's execution, the city became a fortress. White leaders moved quickly, determined that no whisper of rebellion would ever again take root. The African Methodist Episcopal Church, Vesey's sanctuary, the cradle of his conspiracy, was torn down brick by brick until nothing remained but rubble and silence. New laws spread like chains through every corner of the city. Black gatherings were outlawed, night patrols were expanded, enslaved men and women were forbidden to buy or even read books, and free blacks, men like Vesey had once been, found themselves under constant suspicion, their movements restricted, their rights erased. Charleston became a city of watchtowers and spies, where every prayer meeting was suspect, every sermon a potential spark. White citizens carried pistols to church, kept muskets by their bedsides, and taught their children to fear the very people who raised them. The rebellion that never came had already succeeded in one sense. It had exposed the fragility of slavery. It had shown that beneath the veneer of control, white Charleston lived in constant dread. And so, they tried to bury that dread beneath harsher laws and sharper whips. But fear cannot be legislated away. It seeps into the cracks, lingers in the night air, and refuses to die. Denmark. Vesey was gone, but his ghost walked Charleston's streets. Charleston had executed Vesey, but his shadow still hung over the city. To drive it out, white authorities turned Charleston itself into a stage of terror. Gallows stood like grim monuments in the squares. Whipping posts stained with blood reminded everyone who held power. Patrols prowled the streets at all hours, muskets loaded, sabers gleaming, their footsteps echoing like a constant threat. Any black man out after dark could be seized, questioned, beaten. Even free men carried papers that meant nothing if a patrol chose otherwise. Suspicion was enough. Fear was law. The message was clear. Rebellion was not just death, it was annihilation. The city wanted every enslaved man, woman, and child to feel the noose around their necks without ever stepping foot near the gallows. But fear cuts both ways. For white Charlestonians, sleep grew restless. They locked their doors, barred their windows, and kept pistols within reach. Mothers hushed their children at night, terrified of footsteps in the dark. Vesey's plan had not burned Charleston, but it had scorched its soul. The city lived in a state of siege, haunted by the knowledge that the majority of its population longed for freedom, and that one man had nearly given them the courage to seize it. Charleston tried to erase Vesey's name. Instead, they built a city where his ghost ruled every shadow. To Charleston's white elite, Vesey's conspiracy was not just a local nightmare. It was a mirror of something larger, something they had feared for 2 decades: Haiti. In 1791, enslaved men and women on the French island of Saint-Domingue had risen in fire and fury, slaughtering their masters, burning plantations to the ground, and declaring the first black republic in the world. Haiti's revolution sent shockwaves across the Atlantic, shattering the myth that slavery was unbreakable. Denmark Vesey knew that history well. He spoke of Haiti often, holding it up as proof that the enslaved could become free, that black men could govern themselves, that an empire built on bondage could be brought to its knees. To Charleston's planters, Haiti was a word spoken in whispers, a warning of what awaited them if their slaves ever rose. To Vesey's followers, Haiti was salvation. In his plan, ships in Charleston's harbor would carry them across the sea, away from whips and chains, to a land where black men ruled. It was more than a destination. It was a promise that their suffering could end, that they might step onto soil not soaked in their blood. And it was precisely that vision, the shadow of Haiti stretching over the South, that terrified Charleston more than anything Vesey himself could do. Because they knew, if Haiti had burned once, it could burn again. And this time, it might be Charleston's turn. The gallows of Charleston may have silenced Vesey, but his rebellion did not die in South Carolina. It spread like thunder across the South. News of the conspiracy reached Virginia, Georgia, even the distant plantations of Louisiana. Each retelling grew darker, more terrifying. Some swore that Vesey had commanded thousands, that his army was moments from striking, that the streets of Charleston had nearly run red with white blood. Panic became policy. Legislatures across the South tightened their grip, rushing to pass new laws meant to choke every spark of rebellion before it could ignite. Teaching enslaved people to read was outlawed. Black churches were torn down or forced under white supervision. Free blacks were harassed, stripped of rights, and in some states, banished altogether. In the newspapers, Vesey was portrayed as a monster, a fanatic who would have drowned women and children in their own beds. But in the private conversations of slaveholders, the tone was different. Behind closed doors, they admitted what they dared not speak aloud, that a free black man had nearly outwitted them all, and that the very system they depended on was far more fragile than they wanted to believe. Vesey's name became a weapon, invoked by whites to justify harsher laws, whispered by blacks as proof that even in the darkest chains, rebellion was possible. Across America, the question lingered like smoke after fire. If Charleston had come so close to ruin, what city would be next? If Denmark Vesey's body swung from the gallows, his church was crucified beside him. Charleston authorities turned their fury on the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the sanctuary Vesey had built with his own hands, the pulpit from which he had thundered exodus into the hearts of the enslaved. To the city's leaders, it was no longer a house of God. It was the seedbed of insurrection. Armed patrols surrounded the building. Its doors were barred, its members scattered. Then came the demolition. Bricks torn down one by one, pews smashed, the pulpit splintered into shards of wood. The church that had once echoed with hymns of deliverance was reduced to rubble. Its silence meant to bury the memory of Vesey's sermons forever. But destruction was not enough. Laws followed swiftly. Black churches were outlawed unless a white minister stood watch over every prayer, every hymn, every whispered word. Worship itself became a crime if it was spoken in black voices alone. For the enslaved, it was more than just the loss of a building. It was the theft of their only refuge, their only place to gather and believe in something greater than chains. And yet, even as the ashes cooled, memory endured. The enslaved carried Vesey's words in their hearts, humming the hymns he had once turned into prophecy. Charleston could burn his church to the ground, but it could not burn out the dream that had been born inside it. Charleston did not merely kill Denmark Vesey, it tried to erase him. Court records were locked away, testimonies buried in archives where few could ever read them. Newspapers spoke of the conspiracy, but not the man behind it, reducing Vesey to a shadow, a cautionary tale whispered but never fully told. Families of the executed were silenced through terror. Wives and children of the condemned lived under suspicion, their names stained with treason. Even to speak of Vesey aloud became dangerous, a risk that could invite lashes, arrest, or worse. Streets, squares, and schools carried the names of Charleston's planters, its generals, its merchants. But nowhere was Vesey honored. His name was not carved into stone. It was scratched out of history with deliberate intent. Charleston's leaders understood that memory was more dangerous than muskets. If Vesey's story survived, it might inspire others. If his sermons endured, they might plant seeds that no gallows could uproot. So the city tried to smother his legacy under silence, fear, and time. And for decades, it worked. Vesey became a ghost, known only in fragments, carried in whispers among the enslaved, absent from the books and monuments of a nation that feared what his story revealed. But memory has a way of surviving. What is erased is not always forgotten. Though Charleston tried to bury his name, Denmark Vesey refused to stay in the grave. He lived on in whispers. Around fires in the slave quarters, old men spoke of him in hushed tones, their voices carrying across the night like drifting smoke. Mothers told their children of a carpenter who once promised deliverance, a prophet who nearly burned Charleston to the ground. Details blurred with time. Some said Vesey wielded sorcery, that spirits walked beside him. Others swore he had seen visions of fire raining from heaven, a chosen instrument of God's vengeance. In these retellings, he was no longer just a man. He was a myth, a shadow, a warning, and a hope. To whites, he remained a nightmare, a name invoked in fear. For the enslaved, he became something else. Proof that rebellion was possible, that one man could shake the foundations of slavery with nothing but words, courage, and a vision of freedom. And so, even as the records lay hidden and the church lay in ashes, Vesey's ghost walked in two worlds. To his enemies, he was terror incarnate. To his people, he was a martyr. What Charleston tried to erase, memory kept alive, not in ink, but in blood and breath. Decades after Vesey's body swung from the gallows, his prophecies still lingered. Charleston slept with one eye open, its white citizens haunted by the fear that he had not failed, only foretold what was to come. In 1861, those fears erupted into reality. Cannon fire thundered across Charleston Harbor as the first shots of the Civil War were unleashed at Fort Sumter. The city that had once silenced Vesey now became the cradle of the conflict that would finally tear slavery apart. Slaveholders across the South had lived for years with the memory of Vesey's plot, the vision of fire, the whispers of Haiti, the terror of rebellion. They tightened chains, passed harsher laws, and built their society on fear. But fear cannot build forever. It corrodes. It cracks foundations. Vesey had warned them. Slavery was a sin that demanded blood. 39 years after his execution, that blood came. Not from the hands of his small army, but from the armies of North and South. 600,000 dead, the nation drowned in a war that was, in many ways, the fulfillment of Vesey's prophecy. He had dreamed of fire-consuming Charleston. Instead, fire consumed the entire country. And so, in the ashes of war, Vesey's shadow stretched longer than ever. He had not lived to see the death of slavery, but his vision had pointed straight toward it. For decades, Denmark Vesey remained a ghost, a name feared but never spoken, a story buried under Charleston's silence. But history has a way of clawing its way back to the surface. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, historians began to uncover the locked-away records of 1822, the secret trial transcripts, the testimonies, the confessions. Piece by piece, Vesey's conspiracy was pulled from the shadows. What they found was staggering. Behind the gallows and the rubble of the African church lay evidence of a plan that had nearly unmade Charleston. For some, it was confirmation of white fears, proof that Vesey had been a fanatic willing to slaughter without mercy. For others, it was revelation, that a free black man had dared to dream on a scale no American had seen before. The rediscovery of his story brought Vesey back into the national conversation. Abolitionists of an earlier age had whispered his name as martyr. Now historians debated whether he was prophet, terrorist, or visionary. Charleston had tried to silence him, but instead time had turned him into something more powerful than a man, a symbol. And symbols do not die. They haunt. Nearly 2 centuries later, Denmark Vesey's name still divides America. To many white Charlestonians of his time, he was a monster, a man who plotted to murder families in their beds, to drench the streets in blood, to unleash chaos on a peaceful city. That version of Vesey lived on for decades, cemented in history books written by the victors of slavery. But to others, Vesey was something else entirely. A prophet, a martyr, a man who understood that freedom does not come through patience or petitions, but through fire. For abolitionists, his story became a rallying cry. For generations of African Americans, it became proof that resistance was possible, that courage could live even under chains. The debate is not merely about one man. It is about the meaning of justice and the terrible cost of claiming it. Was Vesey a terrorist, or was he a freedom fighter in a land where freedom was denied by law? The answer depends on where you stand. For those who lived in Charleston's grand houses, he was a nightmare. For those who lived in the slave quarters, he was a vision of hope. And in that tension, hero or terrorist, prophet or butcher, Vesey's true legacy endures, because the most dangerous man in history is often the one who cannot be defined. Though Charleston tried to bury Vesey, the soil could not hold him. His prophecy outlived him. More than a century after his execution, the African Methodist Episcopal Church he helped build rose again, rebuilt as Emmanuel AME, standing on the very ground where his sermons once shook the walls. It became more than a church. It was a monument to survival, a sanctuary where Vesey's ghost could still be felt in every hymn, every whispered prayer. During the civil rights movement of the 1960s, his name was spoken once more. Leaders invoked him as proof that the struggle for freedom was not new. It was centuries old, carved into the marrow of America itself. And yet, even in the modern age, Vesey's name carried danger. In Charleston, monuments were built to generals and slaveholders. But Vesey's memory remained contested. To honor him was to admit that America's history was written not only by its rulers, but by the rebels who defied them. Still, his prophecy endured. The idea that justice denied will always breed resistance, that chains cannot silence forever, that even when crushed, a vision of freedom waits, smoldering, ready to ignite again. Nearly 200 years after his death, Denmark Vesey's dream still lingers in Charleston's air, as alive and as unsettling as the night he first whispered it. Denmark Vesey never lived to see the world he dreamed of. His plan collapsed under betrayal, his body swung from a rope, and his name was dragged into silence. But history is not written only in victories. Sometimes it is written in the terror a man leaves behind. Vesey showed Charleston a truth it could not forget, that slavery was not stability, but a powder keg waiting for a spark, that the people in chains were not passive, but watching, waiting, planning, that beneath the calm streets of Charleston lay a sea of anger, faith, and desperation that no whip or law could contain forever. To some, Vesey will always be a terrorist. To others, he will always be a prophet. But perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between, in the haunting space where justice and violence intertwine. Because the question his life leaves us with is not whether Vesey was right or wrong. The real question is this: when a people are denied their humanity for generations, what forms will their demand for freedom take? Charleston tried to erase him. America tried to forget him, yet his ghost still walks, whispering in every corner of history where injustice festers. Denmark Vesey's prophecy was never about one night of fire. It was about the inevitability of rebellion when chains are tightened too far. And that prophecy, as America has learned again and again, has never truly died.